Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Center for Security, Race, and Rights for the latest installment of our Islamophobia lecture series. We're pleased to welcome our guest speaker for this event, Kumar Rao. Mr. Rao is a New York City-based attorney. He holds a Juris Doctorate cum laude from New York University School of Law and a Bachelor of Business Administration with honors from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is currently senior counsel at the Center for Popular Democracy, lecturer in law at Columbia University Law School, and a scholar with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Mr. Rao has worked for a range of large and small rights organizations in the United States and abroad throughout his career, including currently the International Legal Foundation, Center for Constitutional Rights, the Bronx Defenders, Neighborhood Defenders Service of Harlem, and Washington Square Legal Services. He also has extensive experience in the private sector, including as a litigation associate at the law firm Freed, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, LLP. In 2012, he was selected as a Leadership Institute Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., where he joined other professionals of color in leadership training and policy development on issues that affect communities of color. Throughout his career, Mr. Rao has advocated on the full gambit of progressive legal matters in public interest, including criminal defense for the indigent, immigrant rights, human rights, and civil rights. He has represented clients in state and federal court in both criminal and civil litigation matters and has tried more than a dozen cases in New York State, including serious felony jury trials. It is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Rao.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Rutgers Law School. Thank you to the Center for hosting this, what I think is an important event, and something that, as you'll see, has kind of ongoing concern and represents an ongoing issue for our country. So I'm going to start, and you have copies of the report or copies of the executive summary in front of you. I'll give you the link later on to the full report. I encourage everyone to check it out and see the full range of findings. Today, given we have about 25 minutes, we'll give you a little bit of an overview of the findings in the report, but the vast bulk of information is really available through the full report available online. So I'm going to start with a set of stories, some of which you've probably not heard of. In 2010, in North Carolina, an individual named Justin Carl Moose was arrested and alleged to have plotted to bomb an abortion clinic using explosives and other weapons. He described himself as an extremist and a radical, and the, quote, Christian counterpart to Osama bin Laden. This was according to the affidavit filed by the FBI. 4 years later, in Minnesota, a man named Buford Bucky Rogers was arrested and charged with a similar plot, this time to bomb the local police department with various bombs and weapons. In both cases, luckily, law enforcement arrested these individuals before they were able to commit their crimes. The media barely covered either of these stories. The New York Times and Washington Post did not produce a single article about Justin Carl Moose and just two about Buford Rogers. Moose, again, who was charged with a bomb plot against an abortion clinic, was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Buford Rogers to 3.5. In both cases, these individuals actually procured their own weapons. They actually got and made their bombs, had them in their homes operating. Compare this to a different story. This was an individual named Antonia Martinez, who in 2010 was arrested and charged with attempting to shoot at and attack a recruiting center, a military recruiting center. Martinez was alleged to have converted to Islam and was allegedly acting in the name of his religion. He was never actually possessed these bombs or these weapons. They were actually provided to him by the FBI. And according to FBI, the public was, quote, never in actual danger because the device was inert. Antonia Martinez, this incident was covered in the New York Times and Washington Post with 10 articles, again, compared to 0 for Justin Carl Moose. Martinez was eventually charged and sentenced to 25 years in prison for his crimes, again, compared to just 1/10 for Justin Carl Moose. So this is the kind of scenario that we at the Institute for Social and Policy Understanding set out to explore. So why this report? I think many of us have seen over the last several years a lot of discussion, conversation, social media in particular, about this potential discrepancy between how individuals are treated, described, eventually charged, prosecuted, based on their perceived identity. And the idea that really there might be a discrepancy in how this is being done. I think a lot of us have speculation about that. But what this report really sought to do was examine it in a methodological way, quantitative and qualitatively, whether such a discrepancy exists both in our media and legal systems. So again, this report really, has a wide-ranging set of implications for our country, for our democracy, whether it's public safety, public policy, or generally a sense of equality and due process, that individuals obviously should be treated the same regardless of their identity. And that if we all care obviously about public safety, we need to know that we're approaching these issues equally and with the same energy. So here we'll give you a little background on the methodology of this report. So we basically looked at two different kinds of individuals. Throughout the report, you'll see we call them Category A and Category B. Category A were individuals who had committed or plotted to commit violent acts, who were perceived to be Muslim and allegedly acting in the name of Islam. Category B was really, again, individuals committing or plotting violent, ideologically motivated acts who were not perceived to be Muslim. So a couple key words in these incident selection categories. One, again, you'll see we looked at incidents that were committed, situations where there were in fact fatalities, where a perpetrator did commit some sort of atrocity. In both cases, in Category A, we really looked at those individuals perceived to be Muslim and allegedly acting in the name of Islam. We didn't go in setting out to really identify who's who's of what religion, but who was perceived, and that really was key to the report. And we looked at ideologically motivated acts, right, and violent acts, not just general acts, mass shootings where the individual, there was no allegation of some ideology, but really looked at incidents where there was some ideology at the root of the act. The criteria, we looked at existing databases. We selected from a few different well-known databases, and again, picked violent acts or plots. We didn't look at nonviolent incidents. US-based only, and a US target, so not things that happened abroad or were alleged to have happened abroad. And then from 2001 to 2015. And that really was a result of what data was available at the time we began to analyze these findings. Overall, we looked at almost 50 different incidents. They were not picked and chosen. We looked at whatever was available within the data set that met our criteria, and broke them out into 3 general categories. First were what we called primary incidents, and those were situations where there was a completed act of violence, of ideological violence that resulted in 2 or more fatalities. Separated out what we called high-intensity incidents. Those were things where there were very high-level amounts of murder and violence, so 7 or more fatalities or 50 or more injuries. And we really wanted to group those incidents together, acknowledging and sort of, crediting the fact that if you had an incident that resulted in significant amounts of violence, it's going to also result in more media coverage compared to an incident that had less. And then we had a whole other section of what we called violent plots, and those again were alleged plots for violent acts that were foiled by law enforcement, so there was no completed incident. You'll see through the report some sort of high-profile names on the two sides. These are just examples. On category A, Nidal Hassan, who was alleged or who committed a mass shooting at a military base in Fort Hood. Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik, who were the shooters in San Bernardino, California, and of course the Tsarnaev brothers in the Boston bombing. On the other side, incidents, perpetrators like Dylan Roof, who shot inside of a black church in South Carolina, Wade Michael Page, who murdered 7 people inside of a Sikh Gurudwara in Wisconsin, Robert Louis Deere, who shot at a Planned Parenthood and killed several people. So what's really important when you see the findings and when we demonstrate the comparisons between the category A and the category B, were the fact that we really needed to make sure we're looking at an apples to apple comparison. There's a lot of different variations, obviously, a lot of metrics that could affect how a perpetrator incident is covered by the media or treated in the law enforcement system. And what we found through our report really was they were very much apples to apples comparisons on both sides. A range and a set of fatalities, the kinds of weapons used, the intended targets and outcomes, and even the existence of co-perpetrators. So really looking at these incidents and ensuring that we're making adequate and correct comparisons across the two categories. So as I said, we examined both the media system and the legal system in this report. Acknowledging the fact that these are connected systems. The media impact the way law enforcement operate and often how our court systems operate, and law enforcement clearly also affects how the media reports and analyzes these kinds of incidents. On the media side, we focused on the New York Times and Washington Post. Those were chosen deliberately as outlets that are viewed as high-level journalism, as the sort of flagship gold standard of news reporting. We looked at what is the quantity and quality of the coverage of these incidents. You'll see we really dug into the words used and the type of terminology, but also just the sheer numbers and how long these incidents were covered. And then questions around whether the articles mentioned religion, whether that's in the headline, how often were certain words used that are, loaded and fraught with various kinds of implications. On the legal side, we examined a lot of legal documents, sentencing, memoranda, court charging documents, and looked at what were the criminal charges, if criminal charges were filed, what were they? What were the sentences pursued by the prosecutors? What were the sentences ultimately handed out by the judge? And really importantly, did law enforcement provide the instrumentality of the crime? And you'll see in our findings how disparate that was. Before we demonstrate or lay out some of the findings, I want to just kind of make clear what this report was not and what we did not intend to do. We didn't create a comprehensive database of all acts of ideological violence. Again, we relied on existing data sets. It wasn't an attempt to define terrorism or hate crimes, but again, to rely on ideologically motivated violence as the catch-all term of art. And we didn't attempt to identify specific ideologies, right, in any given case. We relied on reporting and perception, which is really the thrust of this report. And we didn't set out to make any specific policy recommendations, although I'm sure we can talk about some of those in the Q&A. So we'll start with the media findings. Here was our findings on the use of the term terror, right? So not just terror, but terrorism and terrorist. In reference, comparing between the perceived Muslim perpetrators versus the non-Muslim perpetrators. And the disparities were significant. across the board. In the vast bulk of articles referencing Muslim perceived perpetrators, the term terror was used in those articles. 77% of the time in the plots, and then 69% and 56% in the completed acts. That's compared to a much smaller minority of cases involving the Category B perpetrators. This is a sheer amount of coverage finding. In the case, this is in relation to the plots, so not the completed acts, but just the plots. In those cases, Muslim perceived perpetrators received 770% more media coverage than non-Muslim perceived perpetrators. So a very, very significant disparity. Here's looking at high-intensity incidents in particular, and again, crediting the fact that if an incident resulted in more violence and more death, it is inevitable that that would be covered more by the media. It's rational and totally expected. So here what we looked at was the coverage, the average number of articles referencing an incident per casualty. So even holding for that, you had a discrepancy in how Category A Muslim perceived perpetrators were covered as compared to the Category B offenders. And in this case, we actually excluded the Boston bombing because we knew how much coverage that received and was really intended to receive that much coverage. And even removing that from the data set, there was still a much higher discrepancy among the Category A offenders. Here's just looking at a couple high-profile incidents where there were, mass amounts of fatalities, and the discrepancy is overwhelming. Oak Creek, Wisconsin, again, the incident where a shooter targeted and went inside of a Sikh Gurudwara and targeted this faith-based institution. Only 72 articles written about that incident. I believe 7 individuals were killed in that incident, including a police officer, and 6 inside. Isla Vista was an incident involving a shooter who went on a rampage targeting women in California, murdered 5 college students and others. Just 36 articles written about that incident. Compare that to, again, the Fort Hood shooting or the San Bernardino shooting, literally, upwards of 10, 12, 15 times the amount of articles written about those incidents. So, we know that this term terrorism is a very loaded one, very fraught. So we wanted to look at how often that's used, not just in the articles which I mentioned before, but even in the headlines of these articles. And it's still in the minority of cases across the board, but in Category A offenders, it's still used at a prominent amount. Almost a quarter of the articles about plots involving Muslim perceived perpetrators had the word terror or terrorism in the headline. We couldn't even compare that to the Category B offenders because there wasn't even enough articles to make that comparison legitimate. But in the other cases, again, it was 7%, 13% on the Category A side and a minuscule amount on the Category B side. References to religion, obviously, a very sensitive and fraught implication as well. So this is looking at the Category A offenders in articles about those perpetrators of incidents. A very significant portion of those articles referenced the individual's religion, 2/3 of them involving the plots, similarly in the primary incidents. We also looked at case studies, so not just kind of quantitative comparisons, but also really started to look at articles and that helped to elucidate and exemplify some of these biases and discrepancies. So here on the left side is a section of an article in the New York Times about the Planned Parenthood shooter. Again, an individual who targeted a Planned Parenthood out of a religious extremist view. And in this article, you can see that this is an article about that shooter, but the only time the word terror or terrorism, terrorist is used is in reference to, quote, the Islamic terrorist. So even in an article that is about a Category B offender that uses the word terror or terrorist, it was used in relation to quote, Islamic terrorists. So similar sort of looks throughout. I encourage everyone to look at the report in its entirety, where we've laid out some of these comparisons. I'll move on for time to the legal findings. So these are particularly, here we are in law school. You really want to think about what this means for our legal system and court system. So here we looked at the kinds of charges that the different Category A or Category B perpetrators were charged with in court. And we broke it out into what we called less severe and more severe. So these are really, a reflection of certain charges carry certain minimum and maximum sentences, right? So less severe charges, things like felon in possession of a gun or unlawful gun possession, would be considered less severe charges. On the more severe charges, we're talking about weapons of mass destruction charges, material support for terrorism, which carry life sentences, and often a minimum of 25 years in prison. And in separating those two, it's really a mirror of one another. The Category A perpetrators were heavily charged with the more severe type of allegation, more severe type of charges. As compared to the Category B. It's basically 83 and 17 on both sides. And keep in mind, we are comparing plots that are very similar to one another in terms of the allegations, involving bombs, involving civilian targets or military or police targets. Here was, again, what prosecutors sought as the amount of time, sentencing. So prosecutors for non-Muslim perceived perpetrators sought out an average in our data set of 76 months. That's compared to the Muslim perceived perpetrators, where the average was 230 months. So 3 times the length is what prosecutors sought for, again, very similar conduct. The prison sentences actually meted out by the court was even more of a disparity, where we saw 4 times as much sentences for perceived Muslim perpetrators as compared to non-Muslims. So here's another sort of major discrepancy that we found, and weren't necessarily going into the report looking to explore this, but it emerged as a very salient discrepancy. So we looked through the charging documents and the allegations and the FBI affidavits, where those cases where the means of the crime were actually provided to the individual by law enforcement, often referred to as a sting operation. So those are situations where the FBI or some other federal agency actually, hands over or purchases or procures a bomb or guns and provides those to the perpetrator, as compared to situations where an individual actually purchases or has or collects guns or creates bombs in their home with no help from the government. So in these cases, 66% of the cases we identified in the Category A side, government actually provided the means of the crime, as compared to a very small percentage in the Category A or Category B category. So this is just breaking it out. It's really 3 and 4 on the Category A side and just 1 and 4 on the Category B side. And this question of the type of charges, it has a very, very significant impact on the outcome of these cases. Muslim perceived bomb plots were charged as weapons of mass destruction, again, the high level charge more than 3 times as often as non-Muslim perceived plots, despite, again, similar facts. So we're talking about the use of and the creation of bombs that, you know, could really injure or maim or murder many, many people. And so the discrepancy was quite significant there as well. And, you know, this is where a lot of the discrepancy really was driven by the fact that WMD, weapons of mass destruction charges, typically lead to over 20 years sentences, whereas defendants who do not receive that typically get less than 5 years in prison. So those were some of our legal findings. We also examined an area where the legal law enforcement system and the media overlap, and looked at the use and way in which the government, the Department of Justice specifically, utilize press releases. So the government issues press releases about these incidents, and they are often the basis for how the media writes about and covers these incidents. What we found was that the U.S. Department of Justice, from its national office, meaning from Washington, D.C., issued press releases 6 times as often in regards to violent plots by Muslim perceived perpetrators compared to non-Muslim perceived perpetrators. And that, again, was from its national office. When you know, the press releases are coming out of Washington, D.C. and signed by senior government officials, it obviously elevates the seriousness of and the likelihood of media coverage and awareness of what's happening. So what we also looked at was not just the quantity again, but also the quality. How is the government itself framing these acts in their press releases? So here's a headline for a Category B offender. Utah man sentenced to 27 months in federal prison for possession of unregistered destructive device. So this is what, you know, the headline of the government putting forward is. It isn't until the 7th paragraph in the press release where the government identifies what the ideology was for this individual, which here they refer to anti-government ideology to watch and track police officers. The plot actually was to attack law enforcement. Now compare this to a press release on the Category A side. This is a quote: 5 radical Islamists convicted of conspiring to kill soldiers at Fort Dix. So, you know, to the point, but also, you know, very blunt language right in the headline of the press release. Similarly, another headline: Nashville resident arrested on charges of possessing machine guns in plan for jihad attack. That is straight from the Department of Justice. So, you know, it's true, these are just a few examples, so, you know, they are just examples, but they really do match up to also the quantitative findings we found. So they are really an extension of the discrepancy here. Again, reiterating the fact that how often the federal government out of DC issues these press releases in Category A cases versus Category B. What was interesting, actually, though, just so that, you know, we are not only talking about discrepancies, there were similarities in how field offices issued press releases, basically at the same rate. So the discrepancy was really in how the offices in Washington put out these releases. And the qualitative ways these press releases were written, were reflected in the numbers as well. So in the Department of Justice DC office, the perpetrator's ideology was referenced in the first paragraph in half the cases involving the Muslim perceived perpetrators, and we couldn't find a single case out of DC where the ideology of the Category B offenders was in the first part of the press release. Again, similar kind of example of this use of words and language. So here was a situation of a man named Samuel James Johnson arrested, charged by the Department of Justice for being involved in the Aryan liberation movement. His plan, according to the FBI, was to attack minorities and the Mexican consulate in Minnesota with a truck loaded with flaming barrels of oil and gasoline. That's the government's allegations. They wrote this headline, this is actually out of the District of Minnesota, Austin felon indicted for possessing firearms. This was similar to the one I mentioned earlier. I'm going to just skip ahead. So here, again, a man named Ahmed Hassan al-Ukaili purchases machine guns, grenades, and ammunition from an undercover agent, right? So again, this one was an incident where the government provided these weapons in a sting operation. The Department of Justice out of DC, its press release headline, right in the headline, jihad attack. So those are some kind of examples of the discrepancy there. I think we can spend some more time now in the latter half of this discussion talking about maybe why we found out what we did. It's I think unquestionable that there are discrepancies, that there are biases within our media and legal systems and how they treat perpetrators of ideological violence differently. And through our research and conversations and discussions with experts and with stakeholders in both fields, we really see this as a structural issue, a systemic issue, as well as one related to individual choice and biases in both systems. So the structural systems in the law enforcement context are really around resources and the money and where different amounts of, or where resources frankly are going in terms of ideological violence. And there are structural, within the court system, the structural impediments or limitations in terms of who is getting charged with weapons of mass destruction or material support for terrorism. So there are structural issues there, but there are individual choices and biases throughout, right? How an editor or a reporter writes a certain story or uses certain terms is a choice. Similarly, prosecutors, judges have power and choices that they make. And so we see that this issue is really driven by both of those potential systems or biases in the system. So we also wanted to just kind of lay clear what we're not suggesting. I don't think any of us really are here to recommend more breaking news or extended coverage of every act of violence or alleged plot in the media. That really would, inflame the fears of people maybe unnecessarily. And we're not recommending that every act of violence should be written as terrorism, whether it's category A or category B. Again, we know that word suggests a lot, and we should be cautious and careful in how that term is thrown around. And then finally, I'm a criminal defense lawyer by training and believe deeply in the fact that we really need to fight and dismantle mass incarceration and mass criminalization. So really aren't recommending the creating of more domestic terrorism laws or to increase the net of terrorism prosecutions. I think part of that is really acknowledging that even if we were to do that in the hopes of balancing out these biases, that eventually would fall on the same communities that are currently being criminalized or subject to biases in the system. What we're really asking for through this report and hoping folks agree with is that equal conduct deserves equal treatment, right? So that's really where we're focus of this report. That's why we entitled it Equal Treatment. And if you want the full report, again, it's on the website ispu.org/equaltreatment. So I think that wraps the presentation, and I think we'll get into a conversation now and hear from people about their feedback and reaction.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kumar, for coming to present to our community here. I first want to send a shout out to some of my colleagues, Professor David Trout, Professor Roseville Zorkuzon. Thank you for attending, and many of my former students. So this project, or this report, although it doesn't fall under academic peer-reviewed research, which is something that hopefully the Center for Security, Race, and Rights will be doing more of to build off of these, what I call more think tank-like reports, brings to light or supports much of the normative research that I have done and others who focus on Islamophobia and the intersection of national security and race. So first I just wanted to make some comments, and then I'll pose some questions, after which we can open it up to the audience. So the first is, the data shows in your report, which is only 52 cases, which was one thing that I noticed was quite small in contrast to the coverage. If you were to pay attention to media coverage about domestic terrorism in particular, you would think that we would have thousands, if not 10,000s of cases since 9/11. So when I saw 52, my first question was, surely there are more than that. So at some point I'd be interested to know why you only used 52, because I would have suspected it to be higher. But notwithstanding, a few things I noticed that confirm my normative research is 2/3 of the cases used informants and undercover agents. So what does that mean? That means that the government is targeting these communities. They are looking for plots. They're looking for terrorists. Right? This is a signal of the prioritization of how they're using their resources and how they're using what they want to find. And as opposed to these other plots, it was almost as if they seemed to have discovered them by chance. Right? These people were already so far along, and then they got some intelligence and said, oh, we better stop them before they actually do it. Whereas with Muslim suspects, they would send in these informants, and those of us who have read the cases, some of these, the facts are quite egregious. So then that in terms of coming just short of entrapment. And that begs the question of the entrapment issue. And one of the puzzles that has caused many of us who study this much confusion and frustration is, how is it that these defendants are not able to win their entrapment cases? Because some of them just seem so obviously a case of entrapment when you look at the facts. Now, my assessment, having not dug deep into each and every case, is that the government is very savvy, and the FBI agents are very well trained to gather evidence of predisposition, right? To show that this individual was predisposed to commit the terrorist act, and all that the agent did is provide the means and opportunity, and therefore the entrapment defense loses, which is an affirmative defense, which the defendant has the burden of proof of showing. So that's my explanation for it. But it shows a major flaw in the doctrine in terms of the outcomes. The other issue is the relationship between the Muslim communities and law enforcement. So the Muslim communities know these results without having to read the report, just by the sense in the community. There are many people who are convinced that the mosques are all being surveilled. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that has a chilling effect. There are people that are convinced that there are FBI informants being recruited every day, and whether they're being recruited for money or they're being recruited as a coercive tactic to prevent or avoid deportation or to avoid some other criminal charge is unknown. But these types of sting operations then create these relationships, these very strained relationships, to put it nicely, between these communities. And then you get back to, well, the other question, which I'm not willing to concede, is, does law enforcement need to work with Muslim communities to counter terrorism? I mean, the problem with that question, one, is it assumes that anti-terrorism is a problem within Muslim communities. The second, it assumes that Muslim communities somehow will have superior knowledge about terrorism plots, that they all tell each other, by the way, I'm about to commit a terrorist act, by virtue of having some common identity or some similar mosque that they attend. So it's a problematic question to pose. But let's just say generally speaking, if we believe that law enforcement should have good relations with the people they serve, which includes the Muslim community, serving and protecting them, not targeting them, these types of actions, I have gone to many places on the record telling Muslim communities, do not trust the FBI. Do not trust the FBI. and that's helped my FBI file grow, because there is no guarantee, no assurances that they will not be exploited. And as you can see with these numbers, which are just minuscule, they receive more money, the funds grow from Congress, and then it's an industrial complex, right? And nobody really cares about the civil rights of Muslims anyway. Okay, the second is the foreign component, which I thought was really interesting in your report, is that most of the Muslim suspects or Muslim perceived suspects, it seems the majority of them had some international links, so material support to ISIS, material support to Al-Qaeda, material support to some foreign terrorist organization. Now, one explanation would be because the laws on material support, it's so easy it's actually a relatively low standard, you don't have to show specific intent, and you just have to show some knowledge, and it could be knowledge that the organization is actually designated and that's it, but you don't have to necessarily know that what you're doing supports directly the terrorist act. So that might be one explanation. The other explanation is that our government and our legal system, particularly the anti-terrorism regime, is already structured to perceive foreigners as a threat. So it's part of the xenophobic infection within the criminal justice system, is if you are foreign, you're presumed to be suspect, disloyal, as opposed to if you're not foreign or perceived as foreign. So that then begs the question of the identity of the non-Muslims. I couldn't find in the report, did you find any trends? I know that you did Muslim perceived and non-Muslim perceived, but what about in these non-Muslim perceived? Because that then gets into what I'll call the traditional criminal justice system, where we've already seen studies that show, one, the identity of the victims has determined the degree in which enforcement is adhered to or enforcement is applied, and also the identity of the perpetrator in the community. So I don't know if you noticed that, or any trends in the ideologies of the non-perceived Muslims. But all of that begs the question, it then asks, well, what do we mean by domestic terrorism? If it's domestic terrorism, it's domestic terrorism. And yet all of them have some international link. So it just opened that question of what do they mean, what does the government mean by domestic terrorism? Okay, a few other points is, I think the strongest finding in your report is the media findings, because they're so stark. And even though I know there are not that many in terms of the total pool, the disparity is quite large. And that's the New York Times and the Washington Post. Imagine if we were looking at Fox News, right? Imagine if we were looking at the outlets where primarily Republican voters look to, because all the polls have shown, if you go to Pew Research Center and Brookings, show that among Republicans as compared to Democrats, the percentage is something around 60 to 70% disfavorable view of Muslims. You get into Trump supporters, it goes into the 80 percentile. So the vast majority of that voter base thinks that Muslims are disloyal, thinks that Islam is incompatible with democracy, incompatible with American values. And it's very explicit. It doesn't want them as their neighbors, doesn't want them in elected government, doesn't want them as presidents. Every single question you can think of, and the numbers are the same. They range 60 to 70, and then 80, above 80 for Trump. In the general population, when you mix it together, it's between 40 to 50, and it's gone up and down between 40 and 50 almost 20 years later. So when you see this, you go, well, this just confirms why everybody has such negative views of Muslims and why they link them to terrorism, because they're told constantly. Every time you see the name Hassan, Muhammad, Ahmed, Mustafa, Mahmoud, you just keep seeing these names, and they're always in the context of a terrorism case. Okay, so I guess those are just my overarching comments, but a few questions I guess I'll just start with to start the conversation.
And I can respond to that first one you raised about the number of cases.
Yes, why don't we start there?
Okay, yeah, so what I guess should be made more clear is that the set of incidents where there was a completed act of violence, those were 2 or more fatalities from 2001 to 2015 in the United States. That is an exhaustive set, so based on the Global START database. So we didn't pick out or exclude other incidents. So
that's 28. Correct?
That's 28, right? So, sorry.
That's 18. 18.
Yep, 18. So, it's the plots set that we randomly selected a finite number on each side to compare because of just resources. There was obviously hundreds of possible plots, and so that's sort of where we made that choice. But I think the fact that there was only a couple dozen at most as an exclusive set shows you that this, I mean, it's obviously, these are, you know, terrible acts that happened, but we do have an elevated sense of how much violence, terrorist, ideological violence happens in the United States.
Right. And it's also preventative. The whole, I mean, then the FBI will tell you that, DOJ, is we're trying to prevent, success for us is preventing the actual act. But yes. So you're saying the 28, which is the total violent act, there's hundreds of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Plots.
Or plots.
Yeah.
Correct. What about the entrapment defense? What have you, when you were digging through the cases, where did you see what were some facts trends that show, that explain why it is so hard to succeed in an entrapment defense? I mean,
it's a general problem. It's not specific to, ideological motivated violence cases or terrorism cases. This happens on a daily basis. It's probably happening in Newark. It certainly happens in New York City on an hourly basis, where local police departments are engaging in what are called buy and bust operations to target drug sales, and often target individuals who are suffering from substance abuse, and then ask them, here's $10 pre-marked buy money, and then the person goes and gets drugs and hands it back, and then bam, they're sort of hit with a drug sale. So entrapment is a very, very difficult affirmative defense to prove in general. And I think, to your point, is also confirmed by an advisor to this report, who was actually a former assistant U.S. attorney and was the lead prosecutor on the Boston bombing case. Really kind of confirmed that the entrapment defense is difficult because FBI agents, various law enforcement agencies have a ton of resources, a ton of training. These cases are, when you read it, they sound kind of absurd as observers when you start to really dissect them, but legally they are tight cases. And they know what they're doing, they've done it, they do it all the time, and so they really can kind of like cover their bases, so to speak, because often they are going into these sting operations with a lot of pre-work already having been completed.
So I'll ask one final question before we open it up. Did you find any trends in terms of the ideologies of the non-Muslim defendants?
Yeah. The overarching, it's really a mix of sort of white supremacist type ideology, anti-government ideology, and they're sort of overlapping, to be honest, which is why it's a little difficult to narrow it into categories. But it's, I'd say white racial supremacy, anti-government ideology, some, and all of which sometimes involves extreme Christian ideology, or perceived Christian ideology. What's interesting was also, and we're seeing this surface more and more, is very scary actually. There's this sort of anti-women kind of ideology underlying some of these incidents as well. And there's been a few acts recently which have kind of elevated that as well, and it is overlapping again with the white supremacists. Can
you elaborate? What do you mean? How is that acted upon?
Literally targeting women for sort of this ideological violence. What happened even, I think, 2 months ago or a few months ago in Florida, there was a shooter who targeted a yoga studio, and it was part of this movement that's growing, it's sort of an online supremacist movement, but has violent misogyny at its root. But again, overlapping with white supremacist type of ideology as well.
Fascinating. Okay, so then that I have to just end before I open up for questions is, if we're going to be driven by facts, right? If our criminal justice system and our taxpayer money and our resources are going to be driven by facts in terms of where the actual security threats lie, and I use security threats broadly, not just national security threats, that begs the question of why don't we have all the politicians in each election cycle using or warning the public about the rise of these movements, about the violence and the plots. And so my response as a critical race theorist is that our criminal justice system as an extension of our government is racialized, and it is itself a product of the dominant group, and the dominant group at this point in history is white, Christian, heterosexual,
men,
and male.
Yeah.
Correct. It may change in the future, depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, and every society has its dominant group. But I think we're in a law school and we study law, and we cannot, this is an example of how that actually plays out in a particular type of at least criminal law enforcement, and how these values affect the way in which we enforce the law.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to very quickly, in 2011, I believe the Department of Homeland Security under Janet Napolitano tried to get more resources to do sort of begin to really analyze and work on white supremacist, anti-government, extreme ideology fermenting in the United States, and was blocked by Congress from doing it.
Right. And I used to work for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security at exactly the time that that memo was issued, and I was on the inside. And it was remarkable to me the amount of backlash that the department experienced, and I am confident that the person who authored it was fired. So it was, you could not touch white supremacy. And at the same time, during that time, this was 2009,
Okay.
2008, 2009, everything, if you read any government papers about anti-terrorism, it was called Islamic terrorism. That's what it was called, Islamic terrorism. And Obama thought that he was being very progressive by keeping the policies the same, but renaming them to countering violent extremism. And his folks were patting themselves on the back because they said, look, we're not going to call it Islamic terrorism anymore. But the policies and the practice stayed exactly the same. So that's something else for law students to be careful of, is just because it's named something different, you got to scratch beneath the surface, it may be the same thing. But yes, that I remember those days. I was definitely a minority view in praising the report. Okay, so with that, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I know some of the undergrads have to leave for class, but if you can stay, please do. We have many law students here, so why don't we open it up? Sahar, would you like to coordinate?
Thanks again for coming and talking about this. I had a question about how the discrepancies that you found in this report compare with general discrepancies in crimes committed by different races, and if they're similar, like how, I guess, if the remedies are also similar to both of them.